Hi, everyone. It's Scott DeWitt, and I'm here today to talk to you about using materials in your multimodal work. I want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer. I'm not an intellectual property lawyer. I teach a lot of digital media composing in my classes, and so today I want to talk to you about how you can use materials in your work and how you can talk to students about how they want to use materials in their work. And I'm interested in how you use those materials both legally and ethically. I'm going to cover a number of areas today. Those areas include copyright, fair use, Creative Commons, the public domain, and then I'm going to end with some final thoughts. Let's start with copyright. So of all of the things we're going to talk about today, copyright is the most restrictive. What a lot of people don't know is that copyright exists from the moment that a work is created. So anything that we write or create, we can claim that it has copyright. Formal registration of something to something that we want to have copyright, that's completely voluntary. But if ever we wanted to file a lawsuit for copyright infringement, that work would need to have go through the formal process of receiving copyright. Whenever we are using work in our own compositions, the first thing to do is to figure out whether or not that work has copyright. And if it does, if it is copyrighted, we must request explicit permission to be able to use that work in our own compositions. So the first thing that we have to do is to figure out who owns the copyright. And that gets very, very tricky. We have to do a little bit of research because sometimes if we want to use an image or a piece of music or a video clip, sometimes that copyright is owned by the artist. Sometimes that work is owned by the artist's estate if the artist has passed away. Depending on the contract that the artist has signed, possibly the copyright is owned by a studio or a recording company. Oftentimes, getting permission to use copyrighted work can be really difficult, especially if it's owned by a really well-known artist who's very protective of their work or a large recording studio. But sometimes it's really quite easy. It's a matter of figuring out who owns copyright and requesting explicit permission to use that work. And that usually means in writing, and that means you are requesting in writing and that you're receiving permission in writing also. Copyright law differs from country to country. So you are paying attention to where you are when you're using somebody else's work and in your own composition, but also where that copyright is, where the copyright owner is at the time. There is no international copyright law. There are efforts to harmonize laws among countries, but right now international copyright law doesn't exist. So there's another area that it can get a little tricky. There are ways for us to use copyrighted material in our own compositions. Fair use is the one that we probably need to consider the most. Fair use is a United States doctrine that allows us to consider using copyrighted work without asking that explicit permission. Excuse me. What we have to do in order to use copyrighted work in our own composition is that we have to be able to show that our use does not impinge on the rights of the copyright holder. And so in many ways, this is a exercise in interpretation. There are no formulas and rules. A lot of people state formulas and rules of what constitutes fair use, but it's actually much more of an exercise in interpretation. The US Doctrine of Fair Use says that in order for us to use copyrighted work in our own composition without asking permission, we have to meet these requirements. The first is that we have to show that our use of the original copyrighted work is transformative. That means that just because I want to use a song in my video and that song is copyrighted, that's not transformative. That's using the work as is in my work. In order for this to be transformative, you have to actually be able to make the argument to demonstrate how my use advances knowledge, how it advances the progress of the arts, how I've added something new to the original. Maybe I've offered a critique of the original. This idea of it being transformative is about how I'm using the work itself. Parody is often falls under fair use because I'm actually thinking about the actual work and I'm using maybe a melody or kind of a certain kind of genre or something that's really well known to an artist, and I am creating parody around that specific work. Whereas satire is not necessarily about fair use. Satire is protected by the First Amendment, but satire is more about kind of a topic that is understood. So we typically need to talk to students about what is the difference between parody and satire and what they're doing with that work. Remix is a really great use of fair use, where I've actually taken the original and I have done something very, very different with it. Oftentimes what I'm doing with work is I'm holding it up as an example for my own analysis or my own critique. So that would be transformative. I'm not using the work just as it is. I'm actually trying to do something very different with it. The second thing that I need to consider then is the amount of work that is used. This is where you often hear people giving you formulas and rules that don't really exist. In short, like the less I use of an original work, the closer I get to fair use. So think about sampling. That's a really great example of a very small amount of original work that I have transformed into something very, very different in the way that I'm using it. And then the other thing we need to consider is the effective value, how my use of the work is commercially diminishing the value of the work, or is it? And in fact, if I'm using copyrighted work and I am diminishing that value, or I am actually diminishing the value because I'm actually making a profit off it, that also becomes problematic. So we need to be able to prove all of those things to be able to create the argument and demonstrate fair use. There's another way that artists are addressing the use of copyright, and that is by saying, I actually don't want to restrict people from using my work. I want to give them the opportunity to use my work in their own compositions. Creative Commons is a nonprofit organization that has created a series of licenses that artists can use to attach to their work, to give permission to others to use that work, but also in particular ways. So they have 4 areas here, and those areas can be pieced together in different licenses. Those areas are attribution. You can use my work, but you have to give me credit for it. Share alike. You can use my work, but you can't stop the sharing. If you're going to use my work, you have to be willing to share it with other people. Non-commercial. You can use my work, but I'm not okay with you making money off of that. And no derivatives. You can use my work, but you have to use it in its complete form. I'm not allowing you to remix it. I'm not allowing you to cut it. So no derivatives. And so as you start to piece these licenses together, they sometimes make the use of the work very open. And sometimes they are saying you can still use my work, but I'm actually going to put some restrictions on how you're using that work. I do want to direct you to the Creative Commons site. This site is amazing. It's so full of really great information about both the legal uses of work and the ethics of using work. And again, their goal is to share work, to let artists share work. They also have a search engine that you can actually look for material, primarily images, but actually they have a new search engine called Openverse that you can find some audio tracks. So I really strongly advise you to look at that site. It's actually a great teaching site. So if you are trying to find ways to talk to students about Creative Commons, assign your students to go look at this site. There is amazing information here, and it's very informative and very, very teachable. The last area that I want to talk about is the public domain. So the public domain is work that where the copyright has expired, or maybe the copyright never existed. So we're going to get to that in a bit, because you remember early on when I was talking about copyright, I said that copyright existed the minute that work was created. So we'll get to why why copyright may never have existed to begin with. Like copyright law, the definition of the public domain changes from country to country, so that can complicate matters a bit. And the definition of the public domain has changed over time. So it's usually an equation of when the work was created and what were the public domain laws at the time. Currently, in the United States, public domain laws state that a work that was copyrighted enters the public domain on the 31st of December, 70 years after the death of the copyright holder. I know that's a lot there, but this goes back then to why understanding copyright is important, because we talked a little bit about who holds the copyright. So you need to go back and do that research, do a little bit of math, figure out whether or not that work has entered into the public domain. You also need to understand exactly what you are working with. So the really clear example that students tend to really understand is the difference between a song and a recording. So a song may have entered the public domain because it meets those definitions of the public domain, but a recording of that song might not be in the public domain. That recording of the song might be copyrighted. So if, for example, my local symphony has recorded a classical piece of music, the song itself is in the public domain, but their recording might have copyright, or it might have Creative Commons licensing. So I would have to do some research to decide whether or not I could use that song. All government documents are in the public domain, which is really awesome because there's really great archives of government documents that students really love working with. And then here's where we get to this idea of when copyright was created. So Creative Commons has recently created a new license that allows content creators to put their work into the public domain. So it is called Creative Commons Zero, and it's when an artist can actually say right from the start that I'm not interested in holding copyright here. From the time that I've created this work, I'm going to immediately put it into the public domain. Some final thoughts on this. You are going to find, and your students are going to find, all kinds of sites that are really rich with content that have names like royalty free and open resources and open source and open access. They all have different licenses and agreements. And so one of the a real important literacy for students to develop is how to find and read and understand those licenses and agreements. It can get very complicated because sites might call themselves open access, and you may be able to download that work and you may be able to listen to that work. But the minute that you want to use that work, there might be a royalty fee attached to that. And without paying that royalty fee, then you are in violation of the license and the agreement. I often say to students, just make your own content. If you're able to do so. So I have students who will often say, oh, I really need the sound of traffic. And what I say to them is, like, if you are living in a city and if you are able to get out and record some traffic, then maybe that's your best result, rather than trying to find sound online that you can use in your own work. Maybe you take a recording device and try to record that. Again, that is if you are living somewhere where there's traffic and you are able to do so. Back to this idea of getting permissions, I do think that it's really a great exercise sometimes for students to ask for permission to use work, and not skipping that step. It teaches them to figure out who owns the copyright. It's an opportunity for them to engage in written correspondence. Sometimes they'll hear back really quickly, sometimes they won't hear at all. But I think that that's really important. And again, sometimes just asking, sometimes getting permission to use work is really quite easy, and it can happen quite quickly. One way that can happen really quickly and easily is to work with local artists. Local artists sometimes are very protective of their work, but also sometimes they're very, very generous. So I say support local artists. Ask if you can use the work, make sure that they know how you're using the work, make sure that you are giving them credit for that work. And the same goes for your colleagues. We work with some really creative, awesome people. And so if you want to use work that your colleagues have created, lean on them, support them, make sure that that their work is getting shared legally and ethically, most importantly. This video and my little presentation here is also available for you to use. Please give me credit, no non-commercial, and share alike, but you can also make derivatives of it if you want to. So there's my Creative Commons license. If you have any questions, again, I'm not an intellectual property lawyer, but I love the act of trying to figure out how to use work legally and ethically. So I welcome further conversation and questions. Come and find me, and we can have some great conversations. Thanks, everybody.